Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are connected. My name is Bertrand Muhunga. I am an engineer with a Bachelor of Science in Petroleum Engineering from Merida College, and it is my pleasure to be your moderator today. So before I'm introducing the speaker, I want to say welcome to everyone to this webinar. It is always a pleasure having you with us. For any questions related to this webinar, please address them on the Q&A section, and we will try our best to answer all of them at the end of this presentation. So without taking too much time, I am going to introduce our speaker, Engineer Abdelrahman, whose topic today is banking in the oil and gas industry. Engineer Abdelrahman is a banking expert who currently works for Community National Bank as a petroleum engineer, financial qualitative analyst in Midland, Texas. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Petroleum Engineering from Texas Tech University and a Master in Business Administration from the University of Texas Permian Basin. Engineer Abdelrahman has worked as a measurement and logging while drilling field engineer for Schlumberger. After receiving his MBA, he moved into the finance and investment banking sector of the oil and gas industry. His work focuses on the Permian Basin, and it includes property evaluation, reserves estimation, oil and gas price differential determination, oil and gas price projections, lease operating expenses evaluation, and new acquisition feasibility studies. Engineer Abdelrahman is currently working on research related to determination of optimal well spacing. Welcome, Engineer Abdelrahman. The mic is yours.
Well, thank you, Bertrand, for that great introduction. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm really happy to be here. So, without further ado, let's jump into the agenda that we have today. And I'd like to go through each part of the agenda first before we start talking about the separate points. So just to give you guys an idea. So we'll start with basics in reserves terminology, to familiarize yourselves with the lingo of the banking industry and just overall that side of the oil and gas industry. Then we'll look into banking in the oil and gas industry. By banking, I mean the impacts that banks have, what banks look for, how they can add value to the industry, and just the overall role that they play. Then we'll look at energy loan types, and those are essentially all the different types that you expect to see within the banking side of the industry. If you are a borrower who has a certain amount of properties that you're looking to get some money on, or if you're planning to acquire new properties, what do you expect from a bank? So those are the loan types. Now, when you look at the loan types, what comes hand in hand with it are loan structures. So there are three major structures that are really common in the industry. We're going to talk about that and sort of dive a little bit into it. Once we are familiarized with the business side, I would say, of the banking and oil and gas, we'll look at data gathering and interpretation, and that's essentially going into the engineering side. So we'll look at what kind of data we need to gather and how do we look at it, how do we evaluate that data. Then we'll look at revenue statements and joint interest billings. For legal purposes, I have pretty much examples out of everything that are here on the agenda that we'll talk about. But for legal purposes, I could not disclose any revenue statements or joint interest billings, but I will go through what we need to look for, how do we look for it, and what's the significance of all the numbers that we look at. Then we'll look at price models and price differentials. What are the different kind of models that we need to have, or how do we set up models to be able to predict prices? And then we'll look at price differentials. So for those of you who don't know what price differentials really mean, it's essentially if I have a well that's producing and say oil is trading at $40 a barrel, I have to pay logistics or logistic costs to get my oil sent to a refinery, right? So essentially, I do not make that $40 on the barrel. There's a differential that I pay. There is a dollar value that is deducted from the oil prices. So we have to take that into account in our analysis. And differentials vary from location, from client. They just have a lot of factors. So we evaluate them on a case-by-case basis. Then we'll look at different types of engineering analyses and just how, once we have all that data, how do we go about evaluating everything? How do we put it in a way to introduce it to, from a petroleum engineering perspective, how do we put it in a way to introduce it to bankers? People that have little knowledge about engineering and about petroleum engineering in general. Then we'll look at projections. That's more, what you expect to see in college. That's the theoretical part of projections. But then there's always that expectation versus reality kind of thing. So yes, this is what we expect to see in college. That's what college tells us. But then we'll look at actual examples. So the actual examples are the things that we are more likely to see on a day-to-day basis. Then one of my personal favorites are PUD evaluations, and I will explain what PUDs are. But just for now, they're proved undeveloped reserves. So we'll look at how we can evaluate something that has not been developed yet. And obviously that's a huge topic by itself. I mean, if I were to just dive into that, I'll take hours. So we'll try to be as brief as possible and discuss all the different factors without, jumping into too much details. Then we'll look at the engineering lending worksheet, and essentially that's the ultimate goal of everything that we do, right? This is how we present our findings. That's how we present our ideas. So we'll look at that. We'll look at the different things that we need to understand from it and what's the significance of them. Then the deeds of trust, and for those of you who don't know what a deed of trust is, it's essentially if I am pledging a property to the bank needs to know that that property is going to be safe. By safe, I mean that the bank needs to know that the borrower is not going to go out and sell the property. He's not going to go out and just get rid of the property without telling the bank. So if the bank has the deed of trust on it, they more or less temporarily own, if you would like, the property. Then we'll look at third-party evaluations and just briefly touch base on the significance of third-party evaluations from an engineering perspective. Then well plats, and I'll explain what well plats are when we get there. Then we'll have a Q&A portion. All right, so first thing first, reserves terminology. So we got 5 main types of reserves terminology that are really common for us to see. The first 3 are perhaps the most common, and the top one is, in my opinion, the most important. And by important, I mean the most valuable in terms of money. So if a company comes into the bank and they want to drill new wells, that's essentially proved undeveloped. So they have, or they know with reasonable certainty, according to logs, according to seismic studies, according to the lease, according to whatever it is, they know with reasonable certainty that if they drill this well, they're gonna get their money back. They're gonna produce oil and gas from it. So PUDs are essentially, again, reserves with reasonable certainty, we believe that if we drill and complete them, we can bring them on production. The thing is that PUDs, from a banking perspective, have a huge amount of uncertainty. Banks in general tend to be conservative. So if I come to a bank and tell them, hey, I think I want your money to invest in that property, the bank will tell me, well, we can do that, but how do we know for sure that you're gonna produce? And that's the problem. So that's why PUDs are not as valuable financially, or you cannot get as much money against them as PDPs. So now, PDPs are proved, developed, producing. And those are wells that are currently on production. You know, they could have been drilled last month, they could have been drilled 60 years ago. They could be old vertical wells, new horizontal wells, they could be directional wells, whatever it is. Point is, they have been brought on production. There is cash flow coming in from them. There is a positive cash flow coming in from them. They have not reached their ECL, their economic limit. So that's why if a client comes to a bank and they tell us, hey, we have some PDPs for you, we'll look into it and we'll be interested. Not to say that we're not going to be interested if they have PUDs or something else, but PDPs are the things that interest us the most. Now, PDMPs. PDMPs are essentially PDPs with only one difference. They are proved, developed, non-producing. So by non-producing, I mean that they could have pending pipeline connections. They could have mechanical or contractual requirements. They could have equipment failure. So you can have a well that's running on an ESP. If the ESP goes bad or something happens and it's no longer running, that well is not going to produce, right? So it becomes a proof, developed, non-producing. Now, changing an ESP will not necessarily be as, in terms of time and, you know, all of that, will not be as bad as a casing leak, for example. You know, if you have a really old vertical well that's, again, been producing for 60 years, that well has integrity problems, has casing integrity problems, has all sorts of things that are wrong with it, it's probably going to take a while to fix it, right? And that while, that uncertainty, is what makes it a PDMP. So if it is uncertain, it's not as bad as a PUD, but in the eyes of banks, PUDs and PDMPs are treated the same. Now, PDSIs and PDBP are not typical for us to see, but they do exist. So PDSI is essentially proved, developed, shut in, and that's really common, you know, with the current economic climate, with the current commodity prices. It's not uncommon to see wells that have been developed and have been producing for a while, but their operators just decided to shut them in. They're shut in for whatever reason. They think it's unprofitable. They just, you know, they decide to do so. So again, this is, in my opinion, not as risky as a PUD, but at the same time, from a banking perspective, we do not know when these wells are going to come back on production. They could come back next month. There are clients that shut in their wells for a few months and then bring them back on, and then there are clients that just permanently shut in their wells. So it depends. Then the last thing, the proof developed behind pipe, and those are just wells that are pending recompletion to another zone, more or less. But yeah, so this is some of the basics terminology that you guys need to know. The greatest emphasis, again, is on PDPs, PUDs, and PDMPs. So now let's go into banking in the oil and gas industry. Who do banks lend money to? Is it just in terms of oil industry? So in Texas, I know that some people are listening outside of the US, and the thing is that in the US, things are a little bit different from other parts of the world. So in Texas and the US, if you own a land, you own its minerals. So if I have a land and I find oil and gas in my property, then I own that, which I can decide if I have, an economically feasible amount of oil and gas, amount of reserves, I can decide to operate it myself. And that will probably make me a small or a medium-sized operator. Then I can I can also have large-sized operators, larger companies. So banks deal with everyone. They fund projects. They fund projects for new acquisitions. If a company wants to borrow money against their PDPs and use that to drill puts, we'll finance that. If they have PDPs and they have a problem with one of their PDMPs and they want to bring it back in production, we'll finance that. So again, it's just obviously on a case-by-case basis, but those are the two main I shouldn't say main, but those are the typical areas of lending from a banking perspective. Banks could also secure loan value against collateral, against oil and gas collateral for activities that are completely unrelated to oil and gas. So that's something else. Now, if the borrowers end up defaulting on their payments, so by defaulting I mean they do not pay back. So for any reason, they cannot pay back whatever money they borrowed. So if they end up doing that, banks can retain these properties. They have the deeds of trust. They can get the properties. They can choose to operate them if they can. But typically what banks do is that they sell them. So they can sell them to other operators. They can get someone to operate. But again, all options are open, and it depends on the lease. It depends on the circumstances. It depends on how much money is out there, if they get a good deal or not. There's a lot of factors to consider. But again, this is all just generic talk. Okay, so now that we know a little bit about the role of banks in the industry, let's talk about energy loan types. So again, like I said, PDP, PDP, PDP. Those are the most important collateral that banks like. So we'll loan money on PDPs, and we call those oil and gas production loans. And the reason for that is because these properties are producing. So we're essentially lending money against production. We'll also lend money against, now see, my list is a little bit, the best case is up top, and then it gets worse from there. So gas gathering systems, pipeline companies, amine plants and compressor stations, all of these we'll lend money to, but it's done a little bit differently. We evaluate the reserves that supply the systems. So if you have a little gas gathering system, how much gas is going into the system? If we can put a dollar value on that amount of gas, then we can evaluate it. Then we can know how much the collateral is going to be. We also look at oil and gas lease acquisition loans, and again, PUD wells, like I previously mentioned. So we'll lend money to companies to just go out and drill, go out and start new projects. So those are leases purchased for future development. An important thing to consider, well, actually, let me not jump into that because we're going to touch base on it in a little bit. So let's keep going. Supply companies. So any supply company in the industry, they will lend the money, but for us to do so, we need to look at the quality of their AR. By AR, I mean accounts receivable. And then we'll evaluate their inventory. So if we look at how much accounts receivable they have, how much inventory they have, we can have an idea of how much that company is worth and how much cash flow it can generate. How much of it is liquid, how much of it is in assets, and how much it can liquidate. Obviously, everything, all the loan types that we have, we apply risk factors to them. But essentially, that's what we look at. We'll also look at service companies. The problem with service companies, it's like workover companies, but service companies are a little bit more complicated. Banks don't necessarily like to lend money to service companies or workover companies. And the reason for that is service companies have highly specialized tools that work on a specific segment of the industry. And banks don't like that. Because if the service companies, like in the current situation, with the oil prices and everything, service companies are struggling out there. They find it hard to find new jobs. They find it hard to maintain, a positive cash flow. And if they don't have that positive cash flow, banks are not going to get their money back. And if they don't get their money back, they have to go in and seize all of the tools or whatever collateral the service company pledged. Now, if the bank has all those tools, what are they going to do with it? The market is down. No one wants to buy them. They're highly specialized tools, so they're worthless. They could be worth something in a few years, but now they're not worth anything. See, banks like liquidity. They want the money with them now so that they can recycle it in another project. If you're going to give me assets, that's not the banking industry. So another thing to consider is that when you have the tools now, they're not going to be worth the same that they're worth now in 5 years, right? You're going to have depreciation on these tools, and it's just a huge risk that banks necessarily don't like to take. But I mean, obviously service companies get money from banks, so I'm just labeling them from the most favorite to the least favorite. Now, workover companies, again, more or less like banks, they're secured by workover equipment, and the main problem that we see in them is that the depreciation during downturns. And again, it's very understandable. When you have downturns, people just don't want to invest in oil and gas. Everything is just frozen, and if they don't invest, no cash flow, no liquidity, it's worthless from a banking perspective. All right. So now that we talked about all the loan types, let's talk about loan structures. So if you come into the bank and you want to borrow money, what do you expect from us? So there are 3 main loan structures that are very common. It's either term loans, revolving credits, or unsecured energy loans. Now, term loans. Those are essentially, you have PDPs. I'm just going to give an example. That may not necessarily be the case, but an example is you have PDPs that have been producing for 20 years. All right. Now you come into the bank and you want money against those PDPs. By against, I mean you're pledging those PDPs as collateral. Now, PDPs usually don't have an upside to them. If they've been producing for 20 years, the production is going to keep declining unless they do something new with the well or the lease or some frac job, some kind of stimulation. You might see a jump in production, but ultimately production is going to keep going down, right? In the long run. So you have to consider that when we look at reserves estimation, we don't just look at it from a year to 2 to 5. We look at it over the life of the well, the life of the lease. So if we are able to look at that, we'll be able to give them value for their PDPs as long as we term it out. So by term it out, you come in today, you want $1 million, right? We'll tell you, okay, we'll give you the $1 million, plus interest, of course, and you're gonna pay us back on terms. Okay, so every quarter you're paying us, I don't know, 100,000 until the note matures. By the note matures, I mean until you repay back your debt. So that is done under 5 years or 60% of the future net revenue. So by 60% of the future net revenue, I mean that if you have wells that are producing now, when are you, if you project everything from a reserves estimation perspective, you will know when is your ECL, your end economic limit, right? End of the economic limit, or economic limit. So if you know when your ECL is, you will be able to tell at when that 60% of your cash flow is going to be, right? So you're obviously, that 60% could come in after 5 years, or it could come in before 5 years. So what we do is we cap it at 5 years, and if the 60% of the future net revenue is below 5 years, then we go with the 60% of the future net revenue, which means that, again, if you borrow $1 million, if 60% of your future net revenue is in 6 years, then you have to repay back that $1 million under 5 years. But if your 60% of the future net revenue is 4 years, then you have to repay back that loan, that $1 million in 4 years. Now, the most common, I would say, are revolving credits. And those are the most common because they sort of stimulate activity, and if done properly, they can generate a lot of cash flow for the banks and the operators. So revolving credits are essentially credit cards with massive credit limits. By massive, I mean millions and millions and millions of dollars. So if I am a company that have a revolving credit of $100 million, I will have the $100 million at my disposal. If I want to go drill wells, I'll just borrow from that money, go fund my projects. Now, the interesting thing is that once I have that money borrowed, I don't have to term it out. I just pay interest on it. So I keep paying interest and interest and interest until at some point, I no longer have any more development. The bank decides, hey, let's term out that loan. Once they decide that, they're going to have to pay it down. So it gives them that grace period to develop and drill more and make new acquisitions. Smart borrowers, and I shouldn't say smart or not, but the more financially aware borrowers borrow money, and as soon as their wells go on production, they start terming out their loan. The reason is the first, I would say, 6 month to 18 month of the well's life are probably going to be the best time in terms of production, in terms of generating cash flow. So if they have that money, that paycheck is not going to be the same 10 years from now. So if they get that money, they should go and term it out. If they term it out, then they can borrow more money that's going to help them drill new wells. But if they don't term it out, if they take that money, spend it on themselves, buy a private plane, do whatever it is, they're not going to have that luxury of borrowing that money, and they're probably going to face financial problems in the future with all that debt just hanging out there, So, and then the last thing is unsecured energy loans. And see, those are not obviously as big of loans as revolving credits or term loans, but they are more or less based on the borrower's character. So if the lending officer thinks, hey, this guy can give us the money back, I know him, I worked with him, I banked him before, or he has ranches, or he has houses, or he has whatever it is, this guy can pay the money back, they will approve an unsecured note. Now the thing is, everything is capped. So as a lending officer, I can go in and be like, hey, I'm going to give you an unsecured loan of $100 million. No. That's no one's going to prove that. But if it's, under 1 million, maybe. All right. Now that we talked about all the banking side, well, not all of it, but we touched base on it, and finance side of the business, let's dive a little bit more into the engineering side of the business. So, by data gathering and interpretation, you have to understand that we have to construct everything from scratch, right? So we look at raw production data that we gather from IHS, Drilling Info, and those, by the way, those two are websites that have public production data that anyone can access, obviously for a subscription, but they are available. That's another thing about the US. I know that in other countries they don't necessarily have public data available, but here in the US they do. Or just simply confidential production data that are supplied by operators. Chevron is making new acquisitions, and they want to borrow money, so they give us collateral as collateral from their PDPs, and the public production data is not as updated as their production data, so we can get their production data and add it to what we have, compare it, see if there are any discrepancies. So it's again, this is just confidential production data between banks and the clients. Then we take all that data and we analyze it through software such as PhD-Win and Arius. PhD-Win is what's most common. Arius is more common for larger clients. So clients that come in with thousands and thousands of wells. But just a side note, PhD-Win is coming in with a new software. They're testing the beta version for it, and it should pretty much do the same thing that Arius does. It will bring it up to that same level, but we'll just see how it goes. All right. Then we look at parameters such as well count, make sure that we have the correct wells in that analysis. We analyze active versus inactive wells, make a note of that. We look at production history, how long has the well been in production for? We look at the current operator that handles the well or the lease. We look at the counties and states, location of them, and then we look at what reservoir they're producing from. So this may seem a little bit intimidating, but it's not once you dive into it. So this is essentially the raw data that we collect. And if I don't know if you can see my cursor here, but so this well or this lease is called University Amanda right here. It's producing from the Devonian Formation. It's operated by BAM Permian Operating LLC, Wadell County. And it's got 2 wells right here in this lease. So that's the API number for the first well, right here, the 421033648340. That well number is number 1. The depth, so those are vertical wells, right? V is for vertical. So the depth of the well, the TVD, is 9,185, and it's an active well. Those are just latitude, longitude. That's pretty much all you need to know here. I think these right here, 8,944, that's your upper perforations. 9,031, that's your lower perforations. Now you gotta know that we take this data and we input it in software. So we don't do this every time. I'm just walking you through it. But the software reads all of this and generates everything for us, and you will see that in a little bit. Again, This is the second well, API number, well number, TVD, it's vertical, it's active, latitude, longitude, upper perforation, lower perforation. And then these wells have been brought on production since 2015, since March 31st of 2015. Oops, sorry. And they keep going, but for simplicity, I just cut it off right here at 2017. So you can see, the dates: 2015, March 31st, 15, February 28th, and that's oil and gas production, and that's basically it. All right. So now revenue statements and joint interest billings. Remember we briefly touched base on it in the agenda. Unfortunately, I couldn't get actual examples to show you, but I'll tell you what we look at. So by revenue statements, they are usually provided by the client, right? By client, I mean operator, or whoever's borrowing the money. The main thing is that we look to see, do these guys have interests in the wells and leases like they say or not? So a well could have, I could have an interest in a well for 5%. Another person can have an interest for 10%. Another person can have the other 85%, right? So just because you come and pledge a well for me, doesn't mean that you own that well. You just own a portion of the well. That portion, we have to analyze. We have to look how much exactly is that portion. And that's done through revenue statements. So revenue statements show the kind of cash flow that the well and the lease generate and how much cash flow are netted to you. So they are used to evaluate oil, gas, and natural gas price differentials. And I will explain how that works. Oil and gas, obviously they have commodity prices that are known for everyone. But then sometimes, say oil is trading at $40 a barrel. Sometimes an operator could be getting $37 a barrel. That means that they're losing that $3. So we have to pay close attention to what money they are getting in the revenue statements to be able to tell how much differentials are. So that's applicable to oil, gas, and natural gas. And obviously I'm not really diving in detail about this, but that's the main idea that you all need to familiarize yourself with. Now, joint interest billings, those are JIBs, again, provided by client. And those are provided by the client if they have working interests in wells. By working interests, I mean, say you have a 5% working interest in a lease, and the lease expenses are whatever, $10,000 a month, okay? Your 5% mean that you have to pay $500. So when we look at the JIBs, it's the same as looking at the revenue statements. We can tell how much your working interest is, how much you owe whoever is running the well or the lease. So it's used to evaluate your working interest and the lease operating expenses. And by that, I mean, whenever we run the economic analysis on the properties, we have to look into how much are you spending to keep those properties running, right? And those are the lease operating expenses. We usually take an average from several JIBs and project that average over the life of the well. We can also dive into the specific details of the lease operating expenses, what it is exactly that they're spending money on. Is it chemicals? Is it pumps? Is it just overall operation costs? Is it electricity? What is it exactly? Then we can tell what areas require the most money. For example, wells are producing a lot of SWD, salt water disposal. SWDs have a lot of costs associated with them. They can also have corrosion effects on casing. So those corrosion effects will have to be treated with chemicals. There's a lot of factors that go into it, but again, it's just a way for us to closely look at LOEs. Excuse me. So, price models and price differentials. So by price models, there are several scenarios that we run in banks to be able to determine the true value of the loans. So you have base case prices, you have NYMEX 5-year strip prices, and you have sensitivity prices. So the base case prices are essentially the price deck that the banks have. We use it to forecast prices in the short and long term. Now, how that's done takes into account numerous things. Usually, it's not just the bank's call. It's obviously every bank decides for themselves, but it's done through research from several third-party consultants. It's done through research from academia. It's done through research from a lot of factors that play a part in determining the prediction of oil and gas prices. Now, these predictions could completely go down the drain if you have a pandemic like what we have now, right? Or they could hold still if things go smoothly. So there's no real say of knowing what exact prices are. That's why they're just predictions. Now, the thing that we do is that we evaluate these predictions usually on a quarterly basis. So every 3 months, we get together, look at the price deck, and think, is the price deck still working? Is it still profitable? In terms of when we use it to evaluate leases, are we giving the leases their true value or not? So that's just what base case prices are. Now, the NYMEX 5-year strip prices, that's just another method of using NYMEX prices and averaging five years worth of predictions, right? Use that and create a price deck and run those numbers, those commodity prices on our estimations, on our analyses, and see what we come up with. Then the sensitivity prices. Those are the worst possible scenario that can happen, right? So, like last year, we had sensitivity prices running about $30 a barrel, which for a good portion of the year, this year, we had that $30 a barrel, right? So worst possible scenario. Obviously, we had drops, oil dropped below 30, but no one could have expected the effects of the pandemic back then. Now, price differentials, again, they're used for oil, gas, and natural gas, and they essentially account for losses due to logistics constraints in commodity selling prices. So by that I mean, say you're producing a lot of natural gas, right? But you just don't have the pipeline to get it through, to get it to the refinery. What are you going to do with that natural gas? You don't have pipelines, you don't have a method of transportation. And that's a problem that the Permian Basin here in the US has been suffering for. And as a result, they started building new pipelines. They started, investing more in the infrastructure of the basin to be able to keep up with that sort of production. So what a lot of operators do is just they go ahead and flare it. They flare it, burn it. Statistics are huge when it comes to the amount of gas that's being flared. But again, it's worthless because they can't get it out. What are they going to do with it? All right. Now, the different types of engineering analyses, again, we touched base a little bit on base case prices, right? So if I go back here, base case prices, NYMEX 5-year strip prices, and sensitivity prices. So the base case prices are an engineering analysis done with a current price tag, right? The roll forward case is 6 months ahead of the as of date. So by as of date, if I'm doing the analysis as of August 1st, 6 months from that, so February 1st of 2021. If I run everything 6 months from now, how much cash flow am I expected to see? So that's a roll forward case. 5-year strip case, again, projections of prices for the next 5 years using the NYMEX 5-year strip. Sensitivity case, again, worst possible scenario. So we'll jump here into looking at total value cash flow base case. That's essentially how much, I know this may seem a little bit overwhelming, but I'll try to break it down real quick. If you look right here, those are all the reports that we have to generate and analyze. So if you look right here, this is a well that's running for 14 years from the date of evaluation, or at least, sorry. So it's from 2020 to 2034. It's got 717 wells at 2020. That well count just keeps decreasing. This is the cumulative oil production that we are expected to see. So we're expecting to have 48,112,000 something. It's got NGL production again, gas production. I think that's 544 million cubic feet of gas. And then we look at the future gross revenue. This is just the net production, net costs and expenses and all that stuff. Future gross revenue is how much money we're expected to make from oil, close to 400 million, from NGLs, close to 15.3 million, from gas, about 52 million. And then when we look at the production tax, the severance and ad valorem, the lease net costs, and the investments and transportation costs and all that fun stuff, we come up with an annual undiscounted future net income before tax. So that annual, again, is right here for every year, and then we do a cumulative annual undiscounted, so we get 241 or 240, close to 242 million. If we discount that at a discount rate of 9%, which is just typical to what we use at the bank, 9%, but it's common to see PV10, so 10% in the industry. So again, it comes down to 135 or 136 million. So that PV9 right here, present worth at 9% is 136 million. So that's the total, right? Now, this is a breakdown by PDP, so proved, developed, producing, reserve, and class category. Essentially, everything is the same data, same explanation that I just went through. If we look at the PDPs for this analysis, it's at 75.538 million. So they have just 4 PDMP wells. Their analysis, the PV9 is at 1.8 million. They have 18 PUDs. They're worth a lot more than their PDMPs. They're worth about 60 million, which if we add all that up, we should get 136 million for the total case. So when we run the analysis, you'll see a little bit. I'll show you how we break down these numbers and present them to bankers. Again, those are PUDs. And then here, that's the roll forward case. So if you notice, that's a different property, but different case. But if you notice, the roll forward case is at 12/1 of 2019. which means that the base case would have been at 6/1 of 2019. We just rolled it forward 6 months. So again, same exact parameters that we look at, and the PV9 right here is 7.212 or 7.213 million. Now, this is a very important example of what we look at when we try to determine when are we going to get our money back. So this is a loan that amounts to 4.5 million right here, 4.5 million. The interest rate is 5.5%, and that is flat for 1 year and increases at an increment of 0.25% annually and is capped at 7.5%. We estimated the overhead expenses to be 10%. Now, what the discount factor is obviously 9%. Now, if we look at the anticipated cash that they are anticipated to get, it's broken down per year, so from 2019 to 2038. Then we look at the overhead expenses, how much they are worth. We'll look at the net operating income, how much it's worth. We'll look at any principal payment and interest payment. So this is essentially saying if this is just we're terming out that loan, right? We want our money back. So in 2019, the borrower would have to make a payment of $493,000. And they would have to make an interest payment of $137,000. 2020, it's going to be $726,000. Interest will be $217,000, and so on, until they repay back the principal payment of $4.5 million. By the time they had repaid back that $4.5 million, the bank would have made $690,000, and it would take them to repay. The loan payoff would be in 5.17 years. So the advance rate in this case is 59.53%. Usually we want to see at 65% or under, and by advance rate I mean that $4.5 million essentially makes up 59.53% of the entire PV9 value. So if we have that under 65%, we're good. This is a good deal. We're making good money, and the loan pays off just fine. And then this is right here. Remember, we're talking about 60% of the future net income. It will be at 9 years. The 75% of F&I is 13.65, and then 100% you will get all the possible money back, all be in 39.6 years. Another thing to look at is right here, that month count. That's essentially just your loan payoff, how many months it will take to pay off everything. And then the remaining F&I before income and tax. That is very important because that's essentially what we call reserve tail. And by reserve tail, I mean how much reserves, how much future net income can be generated from the remaining reserves if this loan was paid off, right? So we look at the interest payment right here and the principal payment. So the last interest payment is made here in 2024, which has also the last principal payment. So if we look here, the remaining F&I is 56.27. To be more conservative, we go with the 51.04, the number that's right under it, which means that if they pay back the money in 5.17 years, we will still have 51.04 remaining future net income that the operator will have. So they give us back our money in 5.17 years, and they still have 50% of their lease to profit from. All right, now, sensitivity case. So sensitivity case, again, is the worst possible case. So you're expecting to see the loan pay off much further out in the future. you're expecting to see a higher advance rate, you're expecting to see a lower reserve tail, and more interest payments because it accumulates for a longer time. So again, they pay off everything in 10.5 years. They will pay more interest at 1.35 million, sorry. The advance rate will be about 85%. So again, it's above our 65% that we like to see. So not necessarily the most optimal case, of course. The remaining F&I, if we look at it, just eyeballing it, is going to be at 29.21%. Not the best, right? 5 year strip, that's just, another example. At that, the price tags for the 5 year strip were kind of close to the base case price tag. So the loan payoff is quite similar, just about half a year off. The advance rate is still under 65%, so we're good with that. And the remaining F&I is at 46%. So overall, this is a good deal to look at. All right, now highest value property per well. This is a breakdown of all the properties that we have in this evaluation, for example. This is how we like to see them. We'll break them down from highest PV9, so discounted net value total, and the percentage that they make of the entire loan, and then we'll just have a little cumulative section on the side. And then if you look here, these have PDPs, PDNPs, that's just an abbreviation of it, PMP, and PUDs, and we'll rank them, and this is just how we display it. This is another way that we like to display properties. We'll say we have total of approved, developed, producing properties, 20. We'll have, in this evaluation, we had 5 leases. Each lease had a certain amount of wells producing from this field, this reservoir run by an operator right here from Andrews County, and the PV9 for each lease, and obviously the location. All right, so the fun part, projections. I'll just briefly go into the theoretical part, and I'll focus more on the practical part. Theoretical, ARB's decline curve equation, right? We all know it. This is how it looks like. We got 3 main types of declines: exponential, hyperbolic, harmonic. Exponential means that our B factor is going to be 0, and it's going to result in a straight line on a semi-log graph. Hyperbolic is more common, ranges from 0.5 to 1.4. I've actually seen it higher than 1.4, but I mean, this is just what's common to see, and it's typical to see, especially in West Texas and tight gas and in tight gas formations, including shale. Harmonic decline, B factor equals 1. I personally have seen just very few that have a B factor equal to 1, but I mean, they do exist. A little bit more detail, I'll let you guys read this. This is exponential decline. So ARB's equation gets modified to that here on the side, since that B factor is equal to 0. Those are the variables, what each variable means. The effective decline rate will remain constant over time. The log rate versus time is going to be a straight line on a semi-log plot, and the cumulative production can be expressed as follows. Hyperbolic decline, again, that's the equation. That's the equation that you use to calculate the cumulative production and the flow rate and all the variables associated with it. Harmonic decline, again, same thing, all the variables, flow rate. The plot of log rate versus cumulative production is going to be a straight line on a semi-log plot. Flow rate and cumulative production equations are displayed as follows. All right, now this is the day-to-day job, actual examples. So this is a lease that has 10 wells. See, that's your well count right here. Has 10 wells. This is going to be your water production. This is going to be your gas production. This is going to be your oil production. So notice the trend on this lease. So when we start off the lease, let's just start from here for simplicity. Here we have 2 wells, and you see once those wells are drilled, you see a spike in production, right? Then as they keep producing, it decreases. So remember what I was telling you? Your first 6 to 18 months are going to be your best month, right? So they produce, so they decline. And then they drill 1, 2, 3, 4 new wells, bring back that point up here. And then again it declines, right? Until they drill new wells. How many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 it seems. And it jumps all the way up there. And again, it keeps declining. So this is a hyperbolic decline. B factor is 1.3, terminal decline is 8, declining at a rate of 96%. The QI right here is at 2,400. Now I have the oil, I don't have the gas displayed. The oil has the most value in this lease. So, but the gas has a similar projection. It's at 1.3. Decline rate is obviously a lot less than 96%, and the terminal decline is usually at 5%. Now this is just a representation of all of the wells in the lease. That's how we like to display them. So we'll say what the well number is, whether it's active or inactive, if it's horizontal or vertical, what's a TVD on it, and what's a lateral length. So those are all horizontal wells. So the lateral length is essentially, from TVD to MD, more or less. Okay. Now this is another example of exponential declines. So this is an older lease. Before I jump into this, let me just go back real quick and show you guys something here. So if you notice here, you got oil EUR. So the estimated ultimate recovery that we predict for this lease is 2.681 thousand barrels. The gas EUR is going to be 7,314 mmcf. So now, if we look at actual examples for vertical wells, so this is a lease that has 4 wells, vertical, declining at an exponential decline. So the B factor is 0. Their decline is at 13%. It's steady, like you see, and this is essentially how it looks like. So if you look at whenever a typical case in which we decide to have exponential declines on wells is if they have pseudo-steady state, or they seem to have pseudo-steady state conditions. So you see that projection is pretty much steady throughout the years, from 2017 to mid-2020. So it's been pretty steady ever since. And even besides this point, if you ignore this and if you just project it from here all the way, it looks pretty steady as well. This is just another example for you guys to see. It's got NGLs, which are also projected as a function of the gas, and yeah, that's pretty much it. Now, PUD evaluations. So they are essentially evaluations of offset neighboring wells. So if a client comes into the bank, they want to drill new wells, we as a bank gotta make sure that if they drill those wells, they're gonna be worth something, right? So how are we gonna know that? We look, so this is an AOI, or an area of interest, that the client is looking into developing, for example. So what I did here is I pointed out those blue dots are wells, right? I pointed out all the wells that have a similar profile to what the client wants to drill. So I take into consideration factors such as the MD, the measured depth, the true vertical depth. We'll talk about logs later, but lateral section length. If they're drilling horizontal wells, what's the lateral going to be? Their perforated intervals, porosity, permeability. And ultimately, once we have all of this data, we can combine it to have an estimated ultimate recovery. So to have an oil and gas EUR. Again, this is one of the fun things that you have to do, because you create a study and predict something out of scratch. So we look at all the different wells. If logs are available, we look at that too. And we look at similar portfolios and try to predict EURs. Once we can predict EURs, we'll be able to put a dollar value to those PUDs, and then we'll be able to lend money against them. So now all of this boils down to this piece of paper right here. So this is what we present as engineers. This is what we present to bankers. So this evaluation is as of June of 19. It's got PDPs, PDMPs, and PUDs. Now we discount everything at a discount rate of 9%. And just a bank policy, because remember I told you that PUDs and PDMPs are not the favorites in the bank's eyes. So banks are not going to give you 100% value for them, but they will give you 100% value for your PDPs. So the way that they cap it is through two things. They cap it at 25%. They cap the PDMPs plus the PUDs at 25% of the entire loan value. Then they take that number, multiply by a risk factor of 80%. And then they advance it at a rate of 65%. So I know those numbers may seem confusing, so I'm going to try to walk you through it. So if you look at the PDMPs and the PUDs right here, 1.79, 4.83. We have to take these two into consideration, add them to this, and make sure that whatever money we're advancing to abide by policy, these two only make up 25%. So notice we give all value to the PDMPs, and we only give 190,000 for the PUDs, even though they're worth close to 5 million, right? And this doesn't mean that the PDMPs are better than the PUDs. It's just how this is structured. If the PUDs were up there and the PDMPs would be down there, we'll probably give more value to the PUDs and less value to the PDMPs. But anyways, so this makes up the 25%, and then you have the 75% for the PDPs. The risk factor is no risk factor for the PDPs. Obviously, there's risk in everything, and that's mitigated by that advanced rate factor. But in this case right here, there's no risk. 100% is given for the PDPs. Then whatever number that abides to policy that comes out of the PDMPs and the PUDs, it has a risk factor of 80%, which brings us to these numbers right here. Now, these numbers, they are further discounted. They're further another risk factor is applied to them at 65% to bring it down to all of this. So that number right here is essentially how much money we can give them. So we think they have $12.6 million, but we're only going to give them $4.9 million. This is a very conservative approach. But this is what banks do. Banks don't just want to lend money and risk it. So again, then we have some information right here. The roll forward case, that's the PV9 for it. It's going to be 7.2 million. The borrowing base that we recommend based on our engineering appraisal is 4.9 million. And the borrower in this case decided, hey, we're not going to even lend them that 4.9. We're just going to lend them 4.5. The borrower just needs 4.5. They don't need all the money. Which means the beginning advance rate is just at 59.5% instead of the 65%. The loan to value, that 4.5 over 12.6 is going to give you that 35.7. The base case reserve tail, remember we looked at the reserve tail, is 51%. It's recommended to be 40% or above. Payout is going to be in 5.2 years, 60% of the F&I. Future net income is going to be 9.1. That ratio between the payout and the 60% of F&I is 0.6. We want it to be at a maximum of 1.0 to conform to policy. That's just the bank's policy that I work in, but it's very common to see it in other banks as well. Then the sensitivity and the 5-year strip case, the payout and the reserve tail displayed here. Then we break down the largest single well and how much it composes of the PV9. Again, we want to see that well making up less than 25% of the loan value, just because we don't want to risk it. If it's more than 25%, if anything goes bad to that well, it's just a higher risk for us. If that well, in extreme cases, blows up, we just lost 25% of, or more than 25% of our potential cash flow. Then the PV9 of the largest single property, that's it right here. That's how much it composes. Again, we want that to be under 50%. And obviously by single property, I mean lease. So lease can have, 50 wells. It can have whatever number of wells. So obviously that number has to be higher than the 25%. That's just the interest rate that we decide to do the loan at. And that's G&A expense rate is basically our overhead rates. Okay, so deeds of trust. Deeds of trust, again, like I was talking about it earlier in the presentation. If a borrower comes in and they want money, we as a bank have to make sure that we are secured. The borrower can't just go behind our back and sell the properties, right? So the bank must hold a deed of trust for properties that amount to 80% of the total PV9. Now that's the bank that I work at, that's their policy. But it's very common to see other banks do the same exact thing. So as long as it's at 80% or higher, the banks are happy. Again, there's legal fees associated with all that, so banks don't really want to overspend on getting deeds of trust. But at the same time, there's just a security net for them. So this is just a breakdown of all the counties, how much they compose of the total PV9. So in this case, we'll probably just get deeds of trust on Yukon County in Texas and Lea, New Mexico, because it's above 80% of the cumulative total. Okay, third-party evaluations. Just a quickly going to go through it. It's required for loans exceeding 5 million in borrowing base. Again, bank policy, but it's common in the industry. And the reason why is because you always want to have that third party opinion. If you're evaluating something that's worth $100 million, if you make one mistake, which I'm not saying you should, but if you do, it's good to have that third party engineer look at it. And that goes vice versa. If that third party engineer makes that one mistake, you can catch it, you'll know you're right, and they'll go ahead with the loan. So that's just another way of making sure that everything is correct, that we have the right evaluation, that we have the right dollar value for everything. And again, just another safety net. So the bank engineer compares his findings, the findings of the third party, to determine the optimal analysis. All right, now well plats. Those are essentially representations of where the wells are, right? So if I am talking about 100 different wells, this is not a detailed picture, but if I look at, if I'm presenting this, I'll be like, so the major concentration of wells is going to be right close to Hobbs and Carlsbad and Lovington. And then I have some wells close to Schneider and Big Spring. So this is to help people relate to what you're talking about and where the wells are. That's essentially what it is. And that brings me to the end of the presentation. I know you all have questions. Bertrand, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I'm here. Thank you very much, Engineer Abdel, for this amazing presentation.
You're
I have
welcome.
a lot of good questions from the audience. The first
Sure.
question is from wait a second. Yeah, the first question is from Mohammed Saad Abdel, who's asking, what is the most dominant type of energy loan structure nowadays in the market? And is there any relation between the type of the loan and the size of the exploration and production company requesting the loan?
Okay, so let me just break this down a little bit, and if I miss something, please correct me. So the most common energy loan, I would say revolving credit lines, and that's because it's. I think it's a win-win situation for the bank and the operator. So if you lend out $1 million to an operator, that $1 million, the operator does not have to pay it down. They just have to pay interest. And as soon as they bring their wells in production, they can start paying down that money. So that extends the time during which the bank will make more money. And at the same time, the operator will give them a grace period to drill, produce, and then have money to pay back and then borrow more money to drill more. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, makes sense.
And what was the other part of the equation of the question?
What is the relationship? Uh, yeah, what is the relation between the type of loan and the size of the exploration and production company requesting the loan?
Okay, relationship between the loan and the size of the company, correct? So the that's a broad question to answer, but I'll try to break it down. Essentially, what you look at is how much that production company is worth, right? And by that, I'm not talking about inventory or assets or anything. I'm talking about their PDPs, their PDMPs, and their PUDs. How much is that worth? Now, once we have a dollar value for all of that, we'll be able to have a loan set up for you. We'll either have it as a revolver or fixed loan amount, but once we have a dollar value, we'll be able to evaluate that.
Okay. The third question is from Salam Khan, who's asking, what are the use of different decline, example harmonic decline uh, in the banking for the oil and gas industry?
Okay. Yeah, that's a very good question. So harmonic decline is not very common. I've been doing this for a while, and have seen very little harmonic declines. What's very common is exponential and hyperbolic. And exponential is essentially for, I don't want to limit it, but it's essentially for vertical wells that have been producing for a very long time. They've reached that pseudo steady state, at which you can just go ahead and project an exponential decline. Hyperbolic is more for horizontal wells. Not to say that you can have hyperbolic declines on vertical wells, of course, but it's more for horizontal wells. It's more for wells that have recently been brought on production that have that turbulent production levels. So yeah, so that's the major classification for it.
Okay. So the last question for today would be how was the transition from studying petroleum engineering and working as a petroleum engineer to studying business administration and becoming a banking expert? And
Okay.
from that question, I'll try to add two questions. One is from Johannes Nuaya, who asks, should petroleum engineer learn and comprehend about banking and microeconomics as well? And also the last one connected to this, what is the future of banking in oil and gas industry?
Okay. Yeah, those are all very good questions. So to go back to the first question you asked, how the transition is like. I mean, honestly, you have to have it in you. Do you like going into the business side of things, or are you more technical? Not to say that what we do is not technical, but you can be a drilling engineer or production engineer or whatever it is. Or if you're interested more into finances, into accounting, into the business side of things, then maybe an MBA is a good option for you. Me, my case, I got out of school in a turbulent time, just like now, and the oil industry was not at its best. But at the same time, I tried out different jobs that were related to business, and I found out that I really like it. So I've always wanted to have that MBA, have that option to do something that I like as much as I like oil and gas. So that's why I got the MBA. And then once I got the MBA, once I had that petroleum knowledge, the opportunity to go into banking just presented itself. You have that engineering background that you need, and at the same time you understand all the business lingo, the language of bankers that you can use to communicate on a day-to-day basis and get the job done. So the transition for me was honestly not very difficult. Once I had the MBA, once I obviously I had the experience from Schlumberger and just petroleum experience, the transition was pretty smooth for me, and didn't take long to understand everything and set everything up. And I mean, I love it. It's been a great experience. Then Bertrand, you said the addition to that question.
Yeah, Johannes Nuara is asking, should petroleum engineers learn and comprehend about banking and microeconomics as well?
Yes. So definitely, yes. The petroleum industry is one of those industries that's affected by everything in the world. There's a lot of politics involved. There's a lot of economic policies involved. There's a lot of things that fluctuate on a daily basis that affect commodity prices and affect demand and supply, right? Once you understand the effects of these and the impact they have on the industry, you will be a more well-rounded petroleum engineer. When you sit down and talk about just the industry in general, you will have a better understanding of the full picture. And if you want to progress more into managerial positions in the future, I strongly recommend having that strong understanding of the fundamentals of economics and the impact they have on the industry in general. The last one, Bertrand?
Yeah, the last one was, what are the future career of banking in the oil and gas industry?
Yeah, so that's it's $1 million question. So the future career in terms of banks, which essentially affect the professionals in the industry. Oil and gas is not going to just go away. It's going to stay here for a while. As long as it stays here for a while, as long as there's demand, there's gonna be a need for supply. And that means that operators are gonna need money to drill. And where are they gonna get that money? Banks. So the future for now, right now, this is not a good time to look at things just because of the impacts of the pandemic and all of that. But if you looked at banking 3 years ago, or even back when oil was at above $100, banking industry was great. Banks were making millions and millions and millions of dollars. So there's a lot of potential in the banking industry with respect to oil and gas, but again, it's affected by the commodity prices and just the general atmosphere of everything.
So I was saying thank you so much for this amazing webinar, and thank you for your time. It was a pleasure having you with us, and we hope to see you again in the future. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and it was my pleasure being with you guys today.
All right. Bye.
All right. Bye. Thank you.